And
all right, you're watching live coverage of the 9/11 Commission investigation into what preceded 9/11 in terms of intel. Sandy Berger, who was National Security Advisor under President Clinton, defending the Clinton administration's record in regard to terror intel. But meanwhile, we have a Fox News exclusive.
First of all, I reject the notion.
This is a Fox News alert. Former counterterrorism chief Richard Clarke, he's set to testify, as we all know, before the 9/11 Commission a little later today, maybe an hour and a half. He's been very critical of the Bush administration, essentially saying that they were unprepared to deal with 9/11, and had they been better prepared, in fact, they might have been able to do something about it. But Fox's senior White House correspondent, Jim Engel, has saved just about every interview on tape that he's ever had, and he's dug up a tape that is a doozy, particularly in this regard. Jim, what do you have for us?
Well, that's right, David. Not just unprepared. Richard Clarke went much farther than that. Richard Clarke now says the Bush administration did virtually nothing about the threat from al-Qaeda until the terror was struck on September 11th. Now we can tell you that he gave an entirely different account in August of 2002, praising President Bush for acting quickly and decisively to change the policies of the Clinton administration, under which Clarke also served. Now, Fox News has an audio tape of a session Clarke had with reporters in which he offers 7 points to demonstrate how much the Bush administration had done and how quickly it had moved to resolve issues left over from the previous administration.
First week in February, decided in principle in the spring to add to the existing Clinton strategy and to increase CIA resources, for example, for covert action, 5-fold to go after al-Qaeda.
Now, Clarke said that in addition to approving 5 times as much funding for going after al-Qaeda, the president also demanded a significant change in strategy.
Changed the strategy from one of rollback of al-Qaeda over the course of 5 years, which it had been, to a new strategy that called for the rapid elimination of al-Qaeda.
Says that while the administration was working with Pakistan and Uzbekistan to deny sanctuaries to al-Qaeda, it was also aggressively pursuing Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda with covert actions. Now, Clarke argues that over the 2 years after al-Qaeda attacks on 2 U.S. embassies in Africa, the Clinton administration had not made decisions about a number of proposals that Clarke himself had put forward, including the need to have closer relations with Pakistan, which shares a border with Afghanistan and was backing the Taliban. Now, of course, President Clinton did try to smooth things over with Pakistan, but there were sanctions in place. There were a lot of criticisms at the time, and I asked Clarke in August of 2002 about the criticisms that the Bush administration had done nothing about relations with Pakistan until al-Qaeda attacked the U.S. At the time, though, Clarke vigorously disputed those charges. Which succeeded in getting Pakistan to drop its support for the Taliban and to start working with the U.S. to try to crack down on al-Qaeda. Now, Richard Clarke, like everyone on the September 11th Commission, has plenty of legitimate questions about how the U.S. pursued al-Qaeda over several years, over 2 administrations, and about all of the agencies involved, from the CIA to the FBI and everyone else. But the assertion that he now makes that the Bush administration did nothing in its first few months was directly contradicted by Clarke himself a year and a half ago. For those who would like to see Clarke's comments for themselves, a transcript is now on foxnews.com. David?
Jim, this is a real bombshell. I mean, because it says not only did the Bush administration go on and do anti-terrorism intel that it needed to do, but it actually changed the policy of the Clinton administration dramatically, a 5-fold increase, and change it from a policy of rollback, as he said, to a policy of elimination of al-Qaeda. If anything, he is defending strongly, in the strongest terms, the Bush administration's policy vis-a-vis al-Qaeda.
Well, in fact, that is the reason he spoke to reporters at the time, because there had been a very critical article in Time magazine suggesting that the Clinton administration had presented the Bush administration with a plan to go after al-Qaeda, and that because the Bush administration held ill feelings toward the Clinton administration, it refused to act on their recommendations. Clarke, of course, was the counterterrorism chief under the Clinton administration as well, and he told reporters in August 2002 there was no plan that was presented from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration, and then complimented the Bush administration for moving quickly to resolve some of the issues that had not been decided, he said, since October of 1998, right after the embassy bombings in Africa. Now, no one doubts that these were difficult decisions. They were hard to do. They were hard even for the Bush administration. You had lots of sanctions on Pakistan, in part for its work in the nuclear area, that all had to be lifted, but there were lots of obstacles. But the fact is, Clarke is now saying the administration moved quickly and decisively to prepare and to work on getting al-Qaeda, which, of course, that's what he said then. Now he's saying they did absolutely nothing, that they ignored the threat until September 11th happened. His own comments seem to dispute that.
Yeah, direct contradiction. Jim Engel, terrific reporting. Thanks very much. And once again, as Jim Engel said, on FoxNews.com, you can see the entire transcript of that tape that was dug up by our own Jim Engel. Now let's go back to the hearings again. Sandy Berger, who was the national security advisor under President Clinton, is speaking now before the committee. Let's listen.
You're not referring to those. We discussed at various times, Mr. Secretary, whether serial bombing of the camps, intermittent bombing of the camps, 2 weeks of bombing of the camps, 17 days bombing of the camps was a sensible option. It was a subject of many discussions, and I think the judgment that we reached, that we came to, was that to use military power in that way, and not to get bin Laden, not to get any of his top lieutenants, but to use our military power to bomb the camps, kill a bunch of people, sure, knock down a bunch of jungle gyms, as Hugh Shelton would describe them, would actually have strengthened bin Laden and al-Qaeda, glorified him, and made us look weak. And that's why we were constantly seeking intelligence with respect to leadership targets that would have enabled that to have some greater force.
One last question, and that is on the coal. Since Clarke used the word Talmudic, frankly, your response on waiting and you didn't really know about coal sounds a little Talmudic. I mean, the time to retaliate for the coal would have been the day after the coal, because as you have rightly pointed out, the administration was basically at war with al-Qaeda, and there was certainly enough evidence, although admittedly not to the satisfaction of the Justice Department perhaps and their evidentiary rules, but it was certainly not the IRA that blew up the coal. And you knew that there had been a previous al-Qaeda attempt on the Sullivan in the same harbor. Why wasn't there enough action to retaliate? I mean, enough evidence.
I believe before the president uses military force in retaliation that he needs a clear judgment from his senior advisors that they're responsible. The day after Pan Am 103, we would have bombed Syria, Mr. Secretary.
But you just told us.
May I finish? We thought TWA 800 was terrorism. It was not terrorism. People actually, dozens of people, saw the missile strike TWA 800 as it went up over Long Island.
Yeah, but you just told us.
Preliminary judgments, I have come to learn, are not the same as judgments. And when the CIA was ready, they were certainly not sitting on their hands. And when they were ready to come back and say, it's our best judgment that this is al-Qaeda, we should have acted. That did not happen on our watch, sir.
But, in fact, it did happen on your watch. It happened in November and
Your
December.
own staff, sir, says it didn't happen on our watch. Your own staff says there was a preliminary judgment
I differ with you on that. But the
It's in the
fact
statement,
is,
sir.
the reality is that you've already testified that if you'd have found bin Laden out in the open, you would have attacked him anyway, even without the coal being
Correct.
hit. But you wouldn't attack him because of the coal. That's a little...
No, I don't follow you, sir, but what I'm saying is, I believe that when responsibility was ascribed for the coal, I certainly would have recommended a strong response, including a response against the Taliban, because in January of 2000, we had warned the Taliban if there was any other attack by bin Laden and al-Qaeda, we would hold them responsible. So this turns on what's the threshold of action. And I think a preliminary judgment, which is the way your staff statement describes it as, a preliminary judgment, is not sufficient for the president to sustain, to go to the world and saying, I've gone to war with Afghanistan on the basis of a preliminary judgment or on the basis of, quite honestly, Dick Clarke's opinion. When the CIA came back and said, sir, we believe this is al-Qaeda, I believe I would have been in favor of acting. I don't think we were at that point, and I'd seen enough situations in my 8 years where preliminary judgments were wrong. The Egypt airplane that went down was terrorism. Oklahoma City, sir, was foreign terrorism for quite some time until we found out that it wasn't foreign terrorism. So I want to see I want to see the Director of Central Intelligence, at least, as the chief advisor of the President on Intelligence, come to the President and say, Mr. President, there's no certainties in this world. We can't be 100% sure, but we believe that this is an al-Qaeda operation. And at that point, I think it would have been ripe for action.
Thank you very much.
I've got one quick question just to follow up, really. Have you read this book, Ghost Wars?
No, I've just read the two excerpts, Governor, from the Washington Post.
Yeah, it's a good book. I mean, it confirms a lot of what we're finding out in this investigation, as I'd recommend it. But one of the things it does detail, similar to our findings, is that there was a real disconnect.
There was, excuse me?
There was a real disconnect between what you all believed was the policy in Washington and what was going on in Afghanistan, including the famous comment by Massoud when he was told, when he was read an order, a legal opinion, as to what could be done and couldn't be done with bin Laden. And I guess my question is, it seems a fact to me, anyway, from the book and from our research, that there was this disconnect. You were meeting every day. I mean, you were meeting every week anyway. You have principals and everything else. You had a clear understanding of what was going on. How could this occur? How could there be?
Perhaps that's a question you should ask the Director of Central Intelligence, because there was no communication, or Cofer Black, who was in the White House twice a week, and never took me aside and said, Sandy, we got a real problem in the field because the instructions are confusing, or we got a lot more capacity to act than you've given to us. Never. Never.
Well, there was somewhere there was disconnect.
Well,
it obviously affected policy.
I would say one thing about that, though, and I think Director Tenner mentioned it this morning. You got a lot of stovepipes in this government, and someone who is sitting down there at the 6th level or the 7th level, or a soldier who is on a battleship, or a CIA operative who's out in the field, doesn't have 360-degree vision on what's going on. So all he knows, or she knows, is what she is ready to do and willing to do, and may not know about the whole picture. And that's why you've got to channel this through, in an integrated system, one central person.
Mr. Chairman?
It's just, yeah, Governor Thompson is next. But
Yes, I understand. There is a document which we have recently received from CIA, and I don't know how much about it we can discuss, but it would shed light on the issue of what CIA operatives in the field told Mr. Massoud at the appropriate time. And I will tell you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sure you have not yet seen that document, that it removed ambiguity in terms of whether Mr. Massoud would be rewarded, whether or not bin Laden was killed or captured.
Mr. Governor, the only last thing let me not say it. Let me let you proceed.
Okay, Governor Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Berger, thank you for your testimony today and for your service to our country. And I will repeat something I said yesterday. I don't know whether you heard it or not, but that I was complimentary of the Clinton administration for its vigorous pursuit of terrorists, Al-Qaeda, EUBL, and all those things that you have testified to this morning. On page 3 of your prepared remarks, there are 2 paragraphs that I think, in essence, you've discussed here today. I'll just highlight them. It was our judgment that to fire on primitive camps and fail to destroy bin Laden or key al-Qaeda figures would have fortified bin Laden and made the U.S. look weak and feckless. And given the circumstances that prevailed at the time, including no support from Pakistan or other neighbors, no base near Afghanistan, and no lead time intelligence, the military leadership concluded that such a mission, that is, boots on the ground in Afghanistan, would fail. Those were the conclusions yesterday, as I understood the testimony, from Cohen, Albright, Powell, Rumsfeld, and this morning from Tenet. And so you associate yourself with those views from those 5
Yes.
people? Okay. When did you brief Condi Rice about terrorism?
Well, as you, of course, recall, we had somewhat of a truncated transition because we had an elongated election. I think I met with Dr. Rice on 3 occasions, and then she received specific briefings from several members of my staff, an hour, 2-hour briefings, along with her deputy and perhaps others. In my first briefing with her, we talked about this issue. I wanted very much to convey to her...
Al-Qaeda? You discussed Al-Qaeda?
Yes.
Yes.
I wanted very much to convey to her the sense of urgency that I felt, because they had been out of government for some time, and the world had changed. And I said to her at that time, and she's acknowledged this publicly, that the #1 issue that you're going to be dealing with is terrorism, and generally, and Al-Qaeda specifically. Then she had a specific factual briefing, Governor, from, I believe, Mr. Clarke and his team. And I went to no other briefings that she went to, staff briefings, except that one. And I showed up at that briefing at the beginning, and I said, Condi, I'm here simply to emphasize how important this is. I'm not going to stay through the whole thing, but I just wanted to underscore how important I think this is. So in every way that I knew how, Governor, I tried to convey that this was now our top priority as a country.
So when Mr. Clarke says in this book that nobody will acknowledge they've read except members of the commission.
I'm eager to read it. I haven't had a chance.
I'm sure you will be. When he said that in his meeting with the National Security Advisor, Ms. Rice, I'll quote, "As I briefed Rice on Al-Qaeda, her facial expression gave me the impression that she had never heard the term before." So since you discussed it with her, that impression of Mr. Clarke's would be erroneous. Is that correct?
I can't comment on that, Governor. I wasn't present. I don't know the circumstances of that. I don't know what the sequence was, quite honestly, of my meeting with her and Dick's meeting with her. All I can tell you is what I said to her and what I did.
Okay. Going to page 7 of
Okay, so as you can see, the testimony of Richard Clarke, it hasn't begun yet. Of course, he was a national security advisor on terrorism, has written a book saying that President Bush did virtually nothing, that's a direct quote from him, about al-Qaeda before 9/11. Being questioned once again because in the book that Richard Clarke has written, he said that Condi Rice was totally unfamiliar, or appeared to be totally unfamiliar, with the words al-Qaeda when he first mentioned them to her. Well, according to Sandy Berger had briefed Condi Rice very adequately and at least 3 times on the question of al-Qaeda and how threatening it really was and how it would be a major focus of the administration. So clearly, according to Sandy Berger, Condi Rice knew at least what Sandy Berger knew, or at least in his briefings had told her about al-Qaeda. But in light of some new evidence that's been brought to our attention by our own Jim Engel, we'd like to throw even more questions about Richard Clarke to Senator Bob Graham. Now, Senator Graham was the head of Senate Intelligence in the summer before the 9/11 attacks, and he had access to a tremendous amount of intelligence about the threat of al-Qaeda, how threatening it was. So he's in a very good position to answer questions about this. Senator, thanks again for coming in.
Thank you.
First, let's start with these Jim Engel tapes. Now, these were tapes that were made in the August of 2002. Jim Engel tape-recorded conversation he had with Richard Clarke, in which Richard Clarke, a man who now says the president did virtually nothing about al-Qaeda before 11, back then said that in the first week of February 2001, right after he became president, the president demanded a 5-fold increase in covert activity and expenses against al-Qaeda, and that he went from a goal of rollback of al-Qaeda, which had been in place for 5 years during the Clinton administration, to elimination of al-Qaeda. There's the exact quote. Does this totally eliminate Richard Clarke as a credible witness?
You're going to be able, as we all will, to hear from Richard Clarke in a few minutes, and I would suggest those should be some of the questions that are asked of him. I would also hope that Ms. Rice would reconsider her previous decision not to testify in public before the 9/11 Commission, since her own credibility, her own background knowledge, and commitment to the war on terror has been brought into question. She should have the opportunity to present her side of the story, not rely on third parties.
Right, but her credibility has been called into question by a man whose credibility is right now on the line. We have his own voice in the tapes recorded by Jim Engel saying exactly the opposite of what he is now saying, not only about the president, but about Condi Rice. So why should we take him seriously?
Well, I will admit, one, I have not read Mr. Clarke's book.
I don't think anybody
has. I've not
has.
heard the tapes that you indicate that Mr. Engel has recorded. I believe the opportunity to ask Mr. Clarke questions that will test his credibility is just a few minutes away. I think the fundamental issue here is the issue of, one, what was the relative priority placed on Iraq as opposed to the war on terror. I believe it is clear, not from words but from actions, that this administration had a focus on Iraq that far exceeded its commitment to an effective war on terror in Afghanistan. First, beginning as early as 2 years ago, this administration ordered that military and intelligence personnel and equipment be moved out of Afghanistan to get ready for the war in Iraq. Two, although there have been leadership which have been sanctioned for unsatisfactory performance in Iraq, nobody has been sanctioned for the unsatisfactory performance that contributed to 9/11. And third, this president has submitted no reform proposals to the American people and to the Congress to strengthen our intelligence so that we will be less vulnerable
Senator,
to an attack in the future. To me, those three things indicate that the war on terror is at a substantially less priority than the war in Iraq.
But, Senator, as to your last point, that the president has done nothing to strengthen intelligence in the United States since 9/11, isn't that precisely what the Patriot Act was all about? And in fact, that's what George Tenet said earlier.
The Patriot Act primarily goes to law enforcement activities conducted through the Department of Justice. It doesn't go to the some 19 recommendations of reform that came out of our joint inquiry that would primarily strengthen our intelligence agencies, such as the CIA, so that they could do a better frontline job of identifying potential terrorist attacks before they occur.
But, Senator, it does break down those walls between the criminal elements and the intelligence gathering elements of both the FBI and the CIA. And that is apparently, according to all FBI agents we talked to and CIA agents, what was holding us back in our pursuit of terrorists.
Well, if I could immodestly say that I was the author of those sections of the Patriot Act that related to enhancing communication between federal law enforcement and federal intelligence. What we need to do now, that we have not done in the last 2.5 years, is to substantially increase the information flow between federal agencies and state and local law enforcement. In this era of terror, it's much more likely that a police officer is going to encounter a terrorist inside the United States than it is that a CIA officer is going to do it.
Senator,
and yet we still do not have an adequate communication between federal, state, and local law enforcement to maximize our chances.
Senator,
of
your former colleague
before they can attack us.
Your former colleague Bob Kerrey, a former senator in the United States, is now questioning Sandy Berger. We have to go to the back. Before we do, I just want to mention one brief thing. That Jim Engel tape recording that we have a copy of was a White House briefing. It was not an official interview, a one-on-one interview with Richard Clarke. It was a White House briefing, and Fox has been given permission to air that tape. We go back now to the 9/11 hearings.
February '98 declaration is strategically important.
Absolutely. The fatwas were terribly important. The document I wanted to show you, this is, it's not like we weren't talking about the terrorism, the Taliban in Afghanistan. We sounded the alarm. Number two, we used all the instruments that we had available to us, whether those were military or covert or otherwise. I think we were at war with the Taliban, Senator.
Sandy, I've got 5. I didn't have enough time to compliment you in the way that I would like to have done. But let's presume that I had 15 minutes to deliver compliments about all the things you're doing. I think you're a great strategic thinker. But when this is when your statement doesn't include that.
I only had 10 minutes in my statement.
Okay, but so you regard the 23rd February press conference in Khost, Afghanistan as a declaration of war against the United States?
I regarded all of the fatwas, I mean, there were several of them, as growing indication that this individual was a strategic lethal threat to the United States.
I just... Even Dr.
There's more than that, fatwa. There's more than that. Your case is stronger than you're making. It's not just one. It's not one press conference. He issued several fatwas.
No, not just several fatwas. First of all, he declared his willingness and then demonstrated his capability to kill Americans. And he was in Afghanistan. And I keep scratching my head and wondering. Even Dr. Rice, at the end of an 8-month planning process, comes up with a 3-part plan. First part is continued diplomacy to try to get Osama bin Laden released from the Taliban. That was part number 1 of the plan. And it seems to me, and it's reasonable, by the way, it's not unreasonable to say, under the circumstances, we just didn't regard this as a strategic threat comparable, for example, to the problems that we were having between Pakistan and India, because I regard this as an enormously important strategic moment, and I understand that I've got hindsight looking back on it, and I see it that way, perhaps a bit more than I did on the 23rd of February, 1998. But it seems as well, if you regard it as a declaration of war, it would seem to dictate everything that follows afterwards, and it would seem to rule out any diplomacy with the Taliban to try to get the release of bin Laden.
I go back farther than that, Senator. I consider from at least August 20th, 1998, when he attacked our embassies and when we could establish that it was responsibility of al-Qaeda, that we were at war with al-Qaeda. And that was one further piece of evidence, as well as other fatwas.
We only used military against a person who had declared war on us, against whom we declared war. We only used our military against them one time, the 20th of August, 1998.
There are 3 ways to use military, Senator, seems to me. Number 1, we could have invaded Afghanistan. I do not believe, and I know you may disagree with this, I do not believe before September 11th that the American people or the international community would have supported an invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, which already, since 9/11, has gone on for 2.5 years in the absence before 9/11. We could have used force by using special forces. We constantly went back to General Shelton and Secretary Cohen and said, what are the options here? The options were lousy. We could have used force by bombing camps that were empty or that were jungle gyms and killed 25 or 30 or 40 Al-Qaeda operatives. And the next day, bin Laden would have had a press conference, and he would have been sitting on top of that cruise missile waving at us in contempt. So use force how? I think before 9/11, the one way to use force to eliminate Al-Qaeda, it seems to me, in its sanctuary, would be to invade Afghanistan. I do not believe that this country was ready to invade Afghanistan before September 11th, notwithstanding the fact we had a president who in 1996 said, this is the challenge of our generation. This is the threat of our generation.
You persuaded the American people that military effort was necessary in Bosnia. You didn't have the House of Representatives with you. You barely had a majority in the Senate. You persuaded the American people that war was necessary to get Slobodan Milosevic to stop his terror in Kosovo.
Yeah, and we also had 19 democracies in NATO in both of those cases that were standing with us together.
Saying, the point is only that if you, the argument that I find to be most unpersuasive is to say we couldn't have gotten it done because nobody had been with us. Because there are several examples during the Clinton administration where you all wanted to do something, you believed it was important, and you came to the American people over and over and over, I thought heroically and correctly, to get public opinion on your side. That's what it's all about. If you'd have come to Congress and said, we're at war, somebody's just declared war on us, and I could understand not doing it until the 7th of August. But after the 7th of August, it seems to me that should have been the U.S. declaration. And every policy option that we had should have followed that. And all diplomacy should have been abandoned.
I think we were at war after the 7th of August.
Done.
Using military covert instruments, rolling back al-Qaeda cells, trying to put as much economic and other pressure on the Taliban. What we did not do is invade Afghanistan. And we'll just have to disagree on this, Senator. I do not believe that was conceivable before 9/11.
Congressman Roma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Berger. Thank you again for your service through the Clinton years and fighting terrorism. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for the thoughtful recommendations that you put in your statement. I hope we get a chance to discuss those a little bit, since part of our mandate is to look forward and try to make the country safer. Let me, without beating a dead horse or poking a dead horse or embalming a dead horse here, poke a little bit more on the USS Cole. In our staff statement, we say that there was an exchange between you and Mr. Tenet, where Mr. Tenet ended up walking out of the room. Was that over the USS Cole?
You know, I read that, and I do remember, obviously, first of all, George Tenet is a good, close, cherished friend of mine. Passions run strong sometimes on issues such as this. And I do remember there was one episode where George left early and suddenly. But I can't honestly say that.
Was he in a good mood or a bad mood when he left?
He was not in a good mood at me, but I can't honestly remember exactly what the proximate cause of that was.
Do you remember the approximate date for his bad mood?
No, I don't. Okay. It didn't happen often. Didn't happen.
There's a great deal of frustration, I think, for some of us in looking back, as you said, through the rear view mirror, which is easier to do, and we see some of these preliminary judgments put forward by the CIA, where they can't get command and control up to Osama bin Laden, but it was definitely operatives of Al-Qaeda. And we have a tough time understanding then why we can't go forward and retaliate against Al-Qaeda generally. Did you, in your frustration and your concern about this, did you try to push the president on a more forward-leaning, aggressive approach to the guilt with respect to the USS Cole?
I think that I believed that the CIA and the FBI was doing everything possible. Now, we had some problems with the Yemenis during the Cole investigation, and they were restricting some access to some of our people. And the President of the United States called the President of Yemen, I believe, on 2 occasions, but certainly on 1 occasion.
This is on a Yemeni investigation, an FBI and a CIA, and he's calling on the...
And the President's called the President of Yemen and said, you've got to cooperate with our people. We're not going to put up with this. And that problem was resolved. Obviously, there were an awful lot of Americans suddenly swarming into Yemen after the Cole. So we were providing support to the CIA and the FBI as they conducted their investigation. I don't believe they were dragging their feet.
I know I'm putting you in a difficult position with both Mr. Tenet and the President, but back to my question. Do you recall trying to push the President a couple times?
I wasn't trying to be non-responsive, Congressman. I don't believe there was, because I don't believe they were dragging their feet. I left off the first half of my sentence. I mean, I don't think that our perception was that they needed a kick in the rear end on this. I mean, my view was that the highest levels of the CIA felt the same. You know, George and I talked about this issue, you know, behind my closed door 2 or 3 times a week in 1999 and 2000. And I had no doubt in my mind that he felt the same sense of urgency that I did.
Back to the briefing.
Last question, Congressman.
Back to the briefing that you gave to Dr. Rice, which you have said several times, and I think that she's acknowledged. Did that briefing include any reference to sleeper cells in the United States? I know the Clinton administration had done an after-action report on the Millennium and found presence of sleeper cells. Did you brief that, or did Mr. Clarke, or did anybody else brief administration officials on that particular aspect?
There was 2 parts of my interaction with Dr. Rice. One was in my office in one of the 2 or 3 times that we had a chance to meet during the transition. She was still in California. She was commuting back and forth. As I've already reported on that conversation, there was a detailed, specific, factual slideshow briefing that she was given, along with others, and that was conducted by Mr. Clarke. I came to the beginning of that in the Situation Room and said, I wanted to show up to show up. I wanted to show up because I wanted to emphasize how important this was as far as I was concerned, and I stayed perhaps for the first 5 minutes and then I left. So I don't know what the substance of that briefing was and whether specifically sleeper cells came up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman. Commissioner Fielding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Berger, I'll just try to ask 3 brief things, just to kind of fill in some blanks. First of all, following up on Commissioner Romer, you know, we're studying an event that is a colossal and tragic failure of our system. And there was one bright light as we're looking through this, and that was the Millennium Plot. And the success of the Millennium Plot and in averting problems. And as I understand, there was commissioned and presented in March of 2000 an after-action report on that. To your knowledge, was that after-action report ever shared with the incoming administration?
Well, let me put it in context. First of all, I requested the after-action report.
Okay.
It was presented to me in February. We had a principals meeting on it on March 10th. There were 29 recommendations. They basically were accepted, subject in some cases to funding. Some of them, a lot of them had to do with domestic security issues The president then submitted a $300 million supplemental to the Congress for additional money and reprogrammed $79 million within the CIA budget, to counter terrorism. Now, some of those recommendations were implemented. As we learned since 9/11, some of them were not. I do not know whether or not that was presented to Dr. Rice, but of course, the people who had originally drafted it were still at the White House.
Okay, so we should look elsewhere for the answer to that. Okay, thank you. Now, I thought I had the authorities issue nailed down until that you said something.
Okay, I'm sorry if I confused
No,
you.
but you said that in your interpretation, what George Tenet was saying was that the capacity was the real issue, and that if he had the chance to do a kill, he would have gone and gotten the authority to do it.
I believe that to be the case, and I believe that to be the way I heard Mr. Tenet this morning.
Right, but if that's the case, that's what I thought too, but if that's the case, wouldn't the inference be that he didn't have the authority?
No, he didn't have the capability.
No, but wouldn't it also be the inference?
You know, these MONs, you know, they're not, I mean, Talmudic is one way to describe them, but
So
the instructions, it was not your description.
You can use Jesuitical if you'd
Yeah,
rather.
I'm not going to offend 5.5 million
Had some
people.
influence on laymen in the interim.
Right.
John, please
They're
move down
drafted
here.
with the CIA, often usually drafted initially at the CIA.
All right, we're going to continue to keep an eye on what's happening with Sandy Berger, but in the meantime, a lot of breaking information, some of it coming from our own Fox News headquarters, where Jim Engel was doing some rummaging around some old tapes he had with Richard Clarke. Of course, Clarke will be the star of the show this afternoon when he gives testimony, some of which probably is based on his book, in which he denounces the fact that President Bush did very little to fight al-Qaeda before 9/11. In fact, some of those tapes from our own Jim Engel say exactly the opposite. Those tapes were from an interview, or actually a briefing, a White House briefing with Richard Clarke back in August 2002, in which Richard Clarke said exactly the opposite, said that as early as February 2001, President Bush was already increasing attacks and covert action against al-Qaeda by a factor of 5. Also, the fact that Bush was changing strategy from a rollback of al-Qaeda to elimination of al-Qaeda. So a lot of questions about the credibility of Richard Clarke, which we'll go into in a moment with a guest. But first, to give a wrap of how the White House sees these 9/11 hearings, let's go to our own Wendell Goler, our White House correspondent in front of the White House. Hi, Wendell.
David, hello. The White House not responding much to the 9/11 hearings, which officials here see as political to a certain extent, though the president's aides say Mr. Bush is anxious to see the conclusions that the commission comes up with to help improve security in this country. I want to talk a bit about Dick Clarke, however, who was head of counterterrorism when the September 11th attacks occurred and was transferred, demoted, if you will, to chief of cybersecurity after that, and left the administration more than a year ago after failing to get the job he wanted as deputy director of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, as you say, my colleague Jim Engel has obtained some tapes of, or one tape of Clarke briefing reporters in August of 2002, saying that the president decided about a month after he took office to go after Osama bin Laden, apparently contradicting Clarke's claim that the Bush administration had done nothing against al-Qaeda early on.
First week in February, decided in principle in the spring to add to the existing Clinton strategy and to increase CIA resources, for example, for covert action, 5-fold to go after al-Qaeda.
Clarke was briefing reporters then as a senior administration official, but the White House agreed today to put the comments on the record. The president has rallied his troops against Clarke, who has written a book blasting the Bush administration's conduct of the war on terror. He made the comments you just heard Clarke did at a time when he was pushing to become deputy director for the Department of Homeland Security and had nothing but praise for the administration's war on terror, especially the decision to end a policy that the president described as swatting at flies and try and destroy al-Qaeda.
Changed the strategy from one of rollback of al-Qaeda over the course of 5 years, which it had been, to a new strategy that called for the rapid elimination of al-Qaeda.
Clarke, of course, testifies before the 9/11 Commission later today. A full transcript of this briefing is on the Fox News Channel website. Meanwhile, the president's press secretary this morning accused Clarke of misrepresenting an administration decision to draw up contingency plans for military action in Iraq at the time we were planning the war in Afghanistan that took down the Taliban. Press Secretary Scott McClellan said that the idea was to be prepared to go into Iraq in case Saddam Hussein took advantage of U.S. troops being occupied in Afghanistan. Dave?
Wendell Goler at the White House. Wendell, good to see you. Thanks very much. And another reporter who's been looking very close at these 9/11 hearings is Michael Isikoff. He is with Newsweek magazine, investigative reporter, and we welcome him to Fox right now. Mike, good to see you. Thanks very much for coming in. First of all, I know you probably haven't had that much time to really analyze these tapes from August 2002 that Jim Engel found. This was from a White House briefing. Jim Engel found the tape from this briefing. We've been given permission to go public with those tapes, obviously from the White House, because they're anxious to discredit Richard Clarke. But it does appear that these tapes do discredit his account of Bush having done virtually nothing before 9/11 against al-Qaeda, no?
I'm not sure I see it that way. I don't think that Clarke says the president did virtually nothing.
That's a direct quote.
And I don't think
that's a direct quote, Michael.
Okay, well, I don't think the tapes discredit Clarke. What the excerpt you just showed had him saying was that the president agreed in principle to do these things, but in fact the substance of the critique is that then led to this prolonged policy process that was not taken with any great deal of urgency, and that went on throughout the spring and summer of 2001, when grave threat warnings were coming in on an almost daily basis to the White House, and didn't culminate until September 4th, 2001, and it wasn't presented to the president until the following week, the day before September 11th. So Clarke may have been doing a little White House spinning on behalf of the president and the White House at the time those tapes were made, but I don't think it undermines the substance of his critique in any way.
Well, I don't want to sandbag because we've had a chance to analyze these tapes. You
That's
haven't.
Okay.
But the point is he says he does use the word in principle, but he says the president in February 2001, long before 9/11, was committed to a five-fold increase covert activity against them. But more important, Michael, he says that there was a change in goal from one of rollback of al-Qaeda, which had been taken in the 5 years of the Clinton administration, to elimination of al-Qaeda. Very specific change.
That's true, and in fact, that's in his book. But the point is that the policy was not. Went through this, long process with deputies meetings and then principals meetings, and it wasn't finally approved until September of 2001. So there may have been this principled idea, we're going to do this, now let's work out the details, and then they spent the next 8 months trying to work out the details, I think. But I think actually, if you've been following the hearings, which I've done, I just came from the hearings and spent the last 2 days there, there's been a wealth of new detail that I have to say largely supports Clarke's account. In fact, almost in every respect. Just today, we had the staff statement from the National Commission in which it talked about how the frustration level within the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA about the lack of response by policymakers to the threat warnings coming in. And one senior CTC people was even thinking of resigning.
Right, I heard that, but Michael, we also had today testimony. Michael, hold on 1 second. Yeah. We also had testimony from Sandy Berger just moments ago saying he told Condi Rice 3 times himself about the threat from al-Qaeda in detail. Then she went to some very specific meetings by the NSC members about that. Let's listen to some of that tape.
Sure.
As has been reported, I told my successor that she would be spending more time on terrorism and al-Qaeda than any other issue. I did my best to emphasize the urgency I felt.
That, Michael, directly conflicts with what Mr. Clarke was saying about Condi Rice, that she was shocked and surprised and apparently had never heard of al-Qaeda before.
Well, look, there's no question that al-Qaeda and the bin Laden threat was on the radar screen of the Bush White House, and that they were developing a policy to deal with it. And there's no question that the president was receiving these threat warnings in the spring and summer of 2001, alerting him and the White House to the prospect of the possibility of an al-Qaeda attack. I think where the criticism is, and where I think the debate is going to be, and we're going to see Clarke testify this afternoon, is what level of urgency was being placed within the White House, within the Bush administration, to this threat. If you listened to Secretary Rumsfeld yesterday and saw the, I thought, quite startling staff statement about within the Pentagon, the lack of attention at any high level to the terrorism threat. Rumsfeld saying he never really was spent any time on it except for the one issue of the Predator. Doug Feith, the Undersecretary for Planning within the Pentagon, gets there in April and is tasked with dealing with the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Nothing to do with terrorism.
And in fact, we just heard Bob Kerry, the former senator from Nebraska, saying the same thing was true with the Clinton administration.
Well, I think what he's criticizing within the Clinton administration was the failure to act. There's no, that after the August 1998 bombing, we had this one military strike, Afghanistan and Sudan, and then while there was a lot of planning, a lot of discussion, even specific operations being on the table, at the end of the day, they never pulled the trigger to go after bin Laden.
Hey, Michael,
they never followed up with
Michael, I got to cut you off.
Attacks.
I just want to hear it. It appears as though the committee has wrapped. Stay with us, Michael, if you can.
Sure.
It appears as though the committee has now wrapped with Sandy Berger. Again, he was National Security Advisor under President Clinton. He was defending very strongly President Clinton's own attention to detail with regard to terrorism in general and al-Qaeda specifically, saying that there was a 350% increase in counter-terror activity under President Clinton. But he was questioned very hardly, ironically, by a former Democratic senator, Bob Kerry, who questioned whether enough had been done. And Michael Isikoff, one question that Bob Kerry had for Sandy Berger was, did you really consider this to be a war? Was this a police action? We've heard this conversation before of whether the Clinton administration did not view this as an all-out war. Sandy Berger said, yes, we did, but he said the invasion of Afghanistan was not conceivable before 9/11.
Right, and I thought that Bob Kerry made some very effective points about how when the White House, when the president under Clinton wanted to do something, invade Kosovo, for instance, or launch the war against Kosovo, it did so even though there was not United Nations support. So there was, his point being that the president has a bully pulpit. He can shape public opinion, and while I think there's little question that Clinton and the Clinton White House was focused on the issue, they never pulled the trigger. They never sought to mold public opinion to develop the public support or the international support for taking the kinds of tough, aggressive actions to deal with this really grave threat to the national security. That's the failure of the Clinton administration. The failure of the Bush administration during those 7 months prior to 9/11 is they didn't take it with the same sense of urgency that perhaps in retrospect, certainly in retrospect, the problem deserved.
Well, yeah, nobody obviously viewed airplanes being used as guided missiles to attack the U.S. from al-Qaeda. Nobody saw that, and so it's kind of hard to connect all those dots.
That's not quite true either.
Who saw that
the August 6th briefing to the president at Crawford did cover the possibility, the prospect of airplane hijackings by al-Qaeda. So that
airplane hijackings,
out
but
there.
did they also think that those hijackings would then, the hijackers would take the planes and use them as weapons?
No, I think the scenario was that they would use it to ransom the release of the blind sheik in the World Trade Center.
So we didn't see it coming. We did not see 9/11 coming either in terms of the scale of 9/11 or actually using planes as weapons. Nobody saw that, right?
Well, no, nobody saw the specific scenario, although I thought there was some really, the commission lapsed quite a bit this morning in its questioning of Director Tenet, because they could have asked a lot more pointed questionings about what was known to the CIA. After all, the CIA did have prior knowledge of 2 of the hijackers. They had tracked them at the famous Kuala Lumpur summit in January 2000 and knew, most importantly, that they had entered the United States and then later knew, after the bombing of the USS Cole, that those guys were linked to one of the key planners of the USS Cole. So there actually was information within the bowels of the CIA that might have led authorities to at least the outskirts of the plot, if not the plot itself. Yet, bizarrely, that issue never came up in the questioning of CIA Director Tenet today.
Final question, Michael. Obviously, everybody's looking forward in one way or another to Richard Clarke's testimony coming up in about an hour. We'll cover it right here live, of course. But the final question politically about these hearings is whether in the end they will come off hurting President Bush or helping him with regard to how he is viewed in terms of fighting terrorism. And the question is whether he did any more or less than what the Clinton administration, the Democrats, did. How do you think it shakes out politically?
I think politically, the overall impact of Clarke's book and the attention the commission hearing is getting is to hurt the president politically. I don't think there's any question about that. This is the franchise. They wanted, the Bush White House has wanted to run for re-election on its competency about terrorism, on its ability to fight the war on terror. And Clarke and some of the testimony has raised questions about, particularly by refocusing that issue on what was done in the 7 months prior to September 11th. That's not to absolve the Clinton administration of any blame, because they get plenty of blame and there's plenty of criticism that can be leveled against them as well. But it's President Bush who's running for re-election. He's the one that has to defend his record, and Clarke, quite frankly, has taken some real swipes at that record that I think is going to stick.
Absolutely. We'll see whether they do stick, though, particularly in light of these new tapes that Jim Engel has dug up that, in fact, contradict directly what he says in the book about Bush having done virtually nothing about al-Qaeda before. Michael Isikoff from Newsweek. It's going to be a fascinating afternoon. I bet you're going to be watching.
I will be there.
And I hope all of you stay with us. We're going to be covering it all from stem to stern right here on Fox. Very exciting day as we look into the origins of 9/11. Stay with us.
Fresh air calls for fresh technology, like the revolutionary EnviroCare IFD air purifier from the Home Depot.
Call, click, or visit today and start trapping pollen, mold spores, dust, and smoke with the only purifier that uses IFD permanent filter technology to create cleaner, more pure ionized air. Order your EnviroCare now. Because it has a permanent filter, you just tap and vac. So you'll save $40 a year on filters. Even better, it's 60% quieter than traditional purifiers and doesn't take up much space, though it's powerful enough for the average bedroom. Best of all, it costs a lot less than other permanent filter purifiers. Order your EnviroCare IFD air purifier now, and you'll get free shipping.
So call, click, or visit your local Home Depot store today and take the freshest approach to breathing clean air.
The Home Depot. You can do it. We can help.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
What do you think you're doing?
You're not the boss of me.
Hey!
Susie, we got a different sitter tonight.
Oh.
You gonna buy it this time or what?
Oh, I'm working on it.
Saving up for overpriced PC gear? Don't go there. Go Dell, where you'll find high-quality PCs and today's hot electronics for less. Like this complete Dimension desktop with an Intel Pentium 4 processor. It's just $499 after mail-in rebate. For a limited time, get a free CD burner and a free memory upgrade. And get even more out of your PC with the new 15-gig Dell DJ. It's only $199 after $50 instant savings. A better way to get it all. Easy as Dell.
Tonight, healthcare, homeland security, the upcoming election, Nancy Pelosi weighs in, plus an economic update with Jon Snow at 4 on a special edition of Your World from D.C. Tonight at 9, her sex life exposed when Kobe faces his accuser. How will the details of her past affect his future on Hannity and Combs? Plus at 10, how did a bitter custody battle involving the Pledge of Allegiance land her in the Supreme Court? The child's mother goes on the record. It's on the most powerful name in cable news, Fox News Channel.
No Observer today because of all the breaking news. We'll see you back here tomorrow, and we'll see you at 5 o'clock tonight. I'll be subbing in for John Gibson with the big story. Right now, it's Dayside with Linda Vester.